from Visigothic kings and Islamic caliphates to imperial conquests and modern-day scandals. The Spanish monarchy has seen it all. This isn't just the story of kings and queens. It's the story of a nation constantly rewriting its identity through power politics and wars. But before we dive in, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your country and the time in the comments. I'd love to see how far and wide history travels long before Spain became a global empire or even a unified country. It was a fragmented land, torn between collapsing Roman rule and rising barbarian tribes, and out of that chaos, one tribe would lay the first real foundation for Spanish monarchy, the Visigoths. The Visigoths weren't native to Iberia. They were outsiders, Germanic warriors who had once sacked Rome itself. But after centuries of wandering through Europe, they settled in what we now call southern France and northern Spain. It was here in the 5th century that they began to carve out a kingdom of their own. When the Western Roman Empire finally crumbled around 476 AD, the Visigoths saw an opportunity. They swept into the Iberian Peninsula and slowly took control, establishing Toledo as their capital. What followed was the birth of the first true centralized monarchy in the region. But let's be clear, this was no fairy tale kingdom. The Metcrace early Visigothic kings ruled through fear, war, and RCT hierarchy. Power often passed not by peaceful succession, but through murder and rebellion. One king, Leo Wild, even went to war against his own son, who had converted to Christianity against his father's wishes. Religious conflict became a defining feature of this kingdom, while the Visigoths followed Arian Christianity, a sect considered heretical by the Roman Church. The local population remained Roman Catholic. It created deep tension, but in 589 AD, everything changed. King Ria Edwy converted to Catholicism, aligning the monarchy with the majority of the people. It was a smart move, one that helped solidify royal power and reduce civil strife. Despite this, unity was always fragile. The Visigothic kingdom had no stable system for choosing kings. Nobles often manipulated, replaced, or even assassinated rulers. Still, the monarchy endured for 2 centuries, until disaster struck in 711 AD. Muslim armies from North Africa crossed into Iberia. The Visigoths were ill-prepared. Their last king, Roderick, died in battle, and within a few years, nearly the entire peninsula fell under Islamic control. Just like that, the Visigothic kingdom collapsed, but its legacy would live on. It introduced the very idea of kingship to Iberia, a legacy that future monarchs, Christian and otherwise, would claim as their own. This was the first chapter in Spain's royal saga, and it was only the paused. Beginning. The fall of the Visigoth didn't mark the end of power in Iberia. It marked the beginning of something entirely new. In 711 AD, an army of Berbers and Arabs crossed the Strait of Gibraltar under the command of a man named Tariq ibn Ziyad. What began as a small campaign quickly turned into a sweeping conquest. The Visigothic kingdom was already crumbling from within, divided by noble rivalries, religious unrest, and political weakness when TK's forces met King Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete. The result was devastating. Roderick was killed, and within just a few years almost the entire Iberian Peninsula had fallen into Muslim hands. This new Islamic territory was named Al-Andalus, and it would reshape the cultural, religious, and political future of Spain. Unlike the brutal tribal monarchies that came before Al-Andalus, brought with it a more structured and cosmopolitan rule. Cities like Cordoba, Seville, and Granada became centers of art, science, and philosophy. The ruling Umayyads didn't just conquer the land, they cultivated it. Under Abd al-Rahman Per, a surviving member of the Umayyad dynasty from Damascus, Alalo became an independent emirate. He escaped a massacre in the Mizes East and fled to Iberia, where he founded what would become one of Europe's most sophisticated Islamic states by the 10th century. His descendant, Abd al-Rahman III, declared himself Kif, turning Cordoba into one of the wealthiest and most advanced cities in the world. Religious tolerance, at least for a time, was part of the deal. Jews and Christians, known as Demis, were allowed to live under Islamic rule, albeit with certain taxes and restrictions. It wasn't equality, but it was a stark contrast to the religious purges of the Vizier. However, Al-Andalus was never fully stable. Internal divisions between Arab elites, Berbers, and local converts led to periodic civil wars and splinter kingdoms. Still, the Islamic presence in Spain lasted for nearly 800 years, a remarkable stretch that would influence architecture, science, language, and even food. And yet, while the South flourished under crescent moons and calligraphy, the North told a different story. Small Christian kingdoms clinging to the mountains began whispering a dream of reconquest. Al-Andalus had risen, but the stage was now set for a centuries-long clash that would define the fate of Spain. While Al-Andalus was flourishing in the south, the north of Iberia told a very different story. Rugged, mountainous, and less accessible, the northern regions became a refuge, a sanctuary for Christian resistance. The Muslim conquest may have been swift and devastating, but it wasn't total. In the shadow of Al-Andalus, small Christian enclaves began to form in the highlands. At first they were little more than pockets of defiance, but over time these communities grew into kingdoms with one goal in mind: survival and, eventually, reconquest. The first spark came in Asuras, where a nobleman named Pello led a rebellion in the early 8th century. According to legend, he defeated a much larger Muslim force at the Battle of Cadona around 722 AD. That battle was small in scale but massive in symbolism. For many it marked the beginning of the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian effort to retake Iberia from Asteras. The Christian world slowly expanded. New kingdoms emerged: Leon, Navarre, Aragon, and Castile. They were often at odds with each other, sometimes even fighting among themselves, but all shared a common enemy in the Muslim South. Each kingdom had its own culture, language, and challenges. Leon inherited much from the old Visigoth, claiming to be the spiritual successor to that lost monarchy. Navarre thrived in the Pyrenees, blending Christian and Basque traditions. Aragon, hugging the Mediterranean, became a military powerhouse, and Kazel, once a frontier county, would eventually rise to dominate them. All these Christian kingdoms didn't just resist, they adapted. They borrowed architecture, scholarship, and even agricultural techniques from their Muslim neighbors. It wasn't unusual to find Arabic inscriptions in Christian palaces or Muslim scientists advising Christian courts. But resistance wasn't purely noble. Christian kings and knights often raided Muslim territories, taking slaves, seizing treasures, and destroying towns. It was a brutal and bloody chess game, fought inch by inch, year after year. Still, with every gained castle, every reclaimed village, the dream of a united Christian Spain grew stronger, and yet unity was still centuries away. For now, the Christian North remained deeply fragmented, a patchwork of crowns, each with its own ambitions, alliances, and rivalries. The reconquest had begun, but the road to a single Spanish monarchy would be long, messy, and full of betrayal. The word Reconquista echoes with the weight of nearly 800 years of history. It wasn't a single war, nor was it led by one ruler or one kingdom. Instead, it was a slow, burning, generational movement, equal parts faith, ambition, and survival. And by the 9th century it had begun in earnest. Christian kingdoms in the north gained strength. They pushed further south, testing the borders of Al-Andalus. It wasn't a continuous campaign. There were long pauses, uneasy truce, and even alliances between Christian and Muslim rulers. But the underlying mission never changed: to reclaim Iberia for Christianity. Each century brought a new wave of momentum. The kingdom of Lon expanded into Gala and pushed into central Iberia. Navarre rose to prominence in the Pyrenees, while Aragon secured the eastern mountain passes. But the real game changer was Castile, originally a cluster of fortified towns, castillos, defending the frontier. Castile evolved into a full-fledged kingdom with an appetite for conquest. In the 11th century, the balance of power began to shift. The once mighty Caliphate of Córdoba collapsed into smaller Muslim states called Tayas, many of which were weak and divided. Christian kings took advantage, launching military campaigns and demanding tribute from their Muslim neighbors. Gold flowed north, sometimes as ransom, sometimes as protection money. This period also saw the rise of legendary figures, none more famous than Elid Rodrigo Dias de Vieira, a complex and controversial knight. He fought for both Christian and Muslim rulers, driven more by loyalty and survival than ideology. His name became immortalized in Spanish folklore as the ultimate Christian warrior, though the truth was far more nuanced. By the late 11th and 12th centuries, the crusading spirit had arrived from Europe. Christian knights from France and beyond poured into Iberia, encouraged by popes who declared the Reconquista a holy war. The line between faith and politics blurred even further. Cities like Toledo and Zaragoza fell back into Christian hands. Churches replaced mosques, and Latin returned to the courts. But with every advance came retaliation. North African dynasties like The Almoravids and Almohads crossed into Spain to support Muslim forces, reigniting the flames of war. The Reconquista wasn't just a war of swords, it was a clash of civilizations, and it was far from over by the 12th and 13th centuries. Two Christian kingdoms began to outshine all others in the Iberian Peninsula, Castile and Aragon. They weren't just regional powers anymore, they were the future architects of a united Spain. Let's start with Castile. Castile's rise was swift and aggressive. Originally a frontier territory within Leon, it broke away and formed its own kingdom in the 10th century. Its name came from the countless castles that lined its borders, defensive strongholds against Muslim incursions. But Castile wasn't content to just defend it. Conquered by the reign of Ferdinand VIII in the 13th century, Castile had absorbed Leon and taken massive swaths of territory from Muslim states, including the prize city of Cordoba. Ferdinand earned the title the Saint for his religious zeal, but his conquests were anything but merciful. Still, under his leadership, Castile grew in both land and power, becoming the dominant Christian force in central and western Iberia. Then there was Aragon, Castile's formidable counterpart to the east, where Castile expanded inland. Aragon looked to the sea. Under rulers like James Ths. Aragon conquered Valencia, Mallorca, and parts of southern France. Aragon wasn't just a kingdom, it became a crown, a loose federation of regions, including Catalonia and later Sicily. Its strength came from trade, naval power, and a shrewd balance between monarchy and local autonomy. The two kingdoms had different personalities. Castile was land-hungry, religiously hardline, and culturally conservative. Aragon was more cosmopolitan, outward-looking, and commercially minded, but both shared one critical goal: the recovery of Iberia from Muslim control. The 13th century marked a golden era for both cities, like Seville and Valencia were brought under Christian control, while Muslim rule was pushed back to a single surviving kingdom, Granada. Despite their power, Castile and Aragon were rarely at peace with each other. They competed for land, influence, and prestige. Royal marriages tried to bridge the gap, but tensions always lingered. Each kingdom saw itself as the rightful leader of a future united Spain. The Reconquista was approaching its end, but a united Spain was still just a dream, for now the fate of the Iberian Peninsula rested in the hands of these two giants, each powerful in its own right, but destined to become even more powerful together. By the mid-15th century, Iberia was still divided. Castile and Aragon dominated the map, but they remained politically separate and frequently at odds. Yet, in 1469, a single marriage would change the course of Spanish history forever. That year, Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon. On the surface, it looked like a typical dynastic union, two young royals tying the knot to secure alliances and consolidate power. But this wasn't just a marriage of thrones. It was the beginning of something far more significant: the unification of Spain. Isabella was heir to the Castilian throne, while Ferdinand was the crown. Prince of Aragon, the marriage was controversial. It wasn't officially approved by the Pope at first, and many Castilian nobles opposed it, fearing Aragon's influence, but Isabella and Ferdinand were determined. They shared a vision of a united Christian Spain, one that could rival the great powers of Europe. When Isabella became Queen of Castile in 1474, and Ferdinand became King of Aragon in 1479, the two crowns remained technically separate. Each kingdom kept its own laws, languages, and institutions, but for the first time in centuries, Castile and Aragon moved in the same direction, led by a single royal couple who ruled jointly and strategically. Isabella and Ferdinand earned the title Los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs, for their zealous pursuit of religious unity. Together, they launched the final push to conquer Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, but more on that in the next chapter. Beyond warfare, their marriage also laid the groundwork for administrative reform. They centralized authority, tamed rebellious nobles, and strengthened royal justice under their to rule. The monarchy became more organized, more authoritative, and more feared. But it wasn't just about power, it was about image. Isabella and Ferdinand presented themselves as chosen by God to lead a united Christian kingdom. They sponsored scholars, expanded royal bureaucracy, and most famously funded explorers who would change the world. Their union didn't legally merge Spain into one country, not yet, but it created a shared destiny, two thrones, one agenda, and soon an Plate's empire. In marrying each other, Isabella and Ferdinand didn't just shift the balance of power in Iberia, they lit the fuse that would explode into one of the most powerful monarchies in human history. For nearly 800 years, Islamic rule had been part of Liberian life, from the rise of Al-Andalus to the glittering courts of Cordoba and Granada. Muslim culture had shaped architecture, science, trade, and even language. But by the late 15th century, it all came down to one last kingdom. Granada, nestled in the rugged mountains of southern Spain, Granada had been holding on while the rest of Iberia fell. The Nasid dynasty, its ruling family, kept peace through diplomacy and by paying tribute to Castile for a time that was enough. But once Isabella and Ferdinand were united, that arrangement no longer satisfied them. Their goal was clear: complete Christian control over the peninsula. In 1482, the Catholic monarchs launched a full-scale campaign against Granada. Unlike previous skirmishes, this was an organized, relentless push. It would last for 10 long years. The war wasn't just fought with swords, it was fought with strategy. Ferdinand carefully negotiated with rival factions inside Grenada, stirring civil unrest to weaken the Nasid regime. Meanwhile, Isabella ensured the war was framed as a holy mission, a crusade blessed by the Pope and supported by nobles and church leaders alike. Inside Granada, the situation grew desperate. Infighting crippled leadership. The last Nasid ruler, Boabdil, faced betrayal from his own family and pressure from his own people. Still, Granada resisted it. Its iconic Alhambra palace, with its intricate Islamic art and stunning courtyards, stood defiant. But by January their 1,492, the end came. Surrounded, outnumbered, and exhausted, Boabdil surrendered the city to Ferdinand and Isabella. According to legend, as Babel left the city, he turned back and wept, his mother watching beside him, said bitterly, "Do not weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." With that, Muslim ruling in Spain came to an end. The Reconquista was complete. Granada's fall was more than a military victory. It was symbolic. It marked the end of an era and the birth of something new, a united Christian Spain, powerful, ambitious, and eager to shape the world. But peace didn't follow. What came next was control, expulsion, and a new vision of national identity, one that would soon take a darker turn with the fall of Granada in 1492. Ferdinand and Isabella had achieved their ultimate goal, a united Christian Spain, but unity in their eyes wasn't just about land, it was about belief. And in that same pivotal year they launched one of the darkest chapters in Spain's royal history, the Spanish Inquisition. Religious uniformity wasn't new in Europe, but the Catholic monarchs took it to a new level. They believed that to build a truly strong kingdom they needed one faith, one crown, and one identity. Diversity was seen not as richness, but as a threat. The primary targets, conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, many under pressure. Although they outwardly embraced the Catholic faith, some were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. That suspicion, whether real or imagined, sparked fear, and fear bred control. In 1478, Ferdinand and Isabella received permission from the Pope to establish their own state-controlled Inquisition, a tribunal independent from Rome but loyal to the crown. By 1480, the first inquisitors were appointed. By 1492, the same year, Granada fell. The Edict of Expulsion was signed, forcing all unconverted Jews to leave Spain under threat of death. Thousands of families were displaced overnight. Entire communities disappeared. Those who stayed faced the Inquisition's relentless eye. Inquisitors had near unlimited power. They operated in secrecy, relied on anonymous accusations, and used torture to extract confessions. Trials weren't fair. Punishments were severe. Property was seized, and those found guilty fed. Public executions, burned alive in the Livenhive, notorious autodafé. But the Inquisition wasn't just about Jews. It expanded to target Muslim converts, Protestants, mystics, scholars, and even regular Catholic accused of unorthodoxy. It became a weapon of control, political, religious, and psychological. And yet, for many Spaniards, the Inquisition wasn't questioned. It was seen as divine justice. The monarchy used it to project power and moral superiority, shaping Spain into a nation that equated loyalty to the crown with loyalty to the church. Behind the grandeur of Isabella and Ferdinand's rule, the conquests, the diplomacy, the exploration, lay this shadow, a system built on suspicion, fear, and forced conformity. The Inquisition would last for over 3 centuries, becoming one of the most infamous institutions in European history. And yet, even as Spain cleansed itself, within it was turning its eyes outward, toward the unknown, toward the West, and toward a new world. 1492 wasn't just the year the Catholic monarchs conquered Granada or expelled the Jews. It was also the year that changed the world forever, thanks to a bold, stubborn explorer named Christopher Columbus. Columbus, a Geno sailor with grand dreams, believed he could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. For years he pitched his plan to European courts, Portugal, England, France, but was repeatedly rejected. His idea seemed mad, even dangerous. Most thought the voyage would end in disaster, but Isabella of Castile saw something in him. Maybe it was ambition, maybe desperation, or maybe the hope of beating Portugal in the global exploration race. Whatever the reason, in April 1492, she and Ferdinand agreed to fund Columbus's voyage. They gave him ships, a crew, and a contract, promising him titles, wealth, and power if he succeeded. On the 3rd of August 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 ships, the Ni, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After more than 2 months at sea, just when his crew was on the verge of mutiny, they spotted land, but it wasn't Asia. It was an island in what we now called the Caribbean. Columbus believed he had reached the Indies. He called the native people Indians and claimed the land for Spain. He had no idea he'd stumbled upon a continent unknown to Europeans. But it didn't matter. The door had been opened, and Spain would be the first through it. Columbus returned to Spain, a hero go old. Spices, exotic animals, and enslaved people were paraded before the royal court. The monarchs were thrilled. They funded more voyages, more ships, more conquests. What began as a gamble became a global empire. In the decades that followed, Spanish explorers, conquistadors, swept through the Americas. Cortez toppled the Aztec Empire. Pizarro crushed the Incas from Mexico to Peru. Vast civilizations fell under the Spanish sword. Spain didn't just grow, it exploded. It became the richest, most powerful kingdom in Europe, flush with gold and silver from the New World. The monarchy now had the resources to dominate politics, fund wars, and shape the course of European history. The age of Spanish imperial monarchy had begun, but with great power comes even greater challenges, and the next king would inherit an empire bursting at the seams. By the early 1500s, Spain had transformed from a patchwork of kingdoms into a rising empire. But with the death of Ferdinand in 1516, a new figure would take the throne, one whose inheritance would stretch far beyond the borders of Spain. His name was Charles I of Spain, and his rise marked the beginning of the Habsburg dynasty. Charles was the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella through his mother Joanna of Castile, but his father, Philip the Handsome, was a Habsburg prince, the son of Max's Milan, the Holy Roman Emperor. When Charles was just 16, both his grandfathers died, leaving him with an inheritance so vast it made him the most powerful monarch in Europe. By 1519, Charles was not only king of Spain, but also elected Holy Roman Emperor, becoming Charles F. No king before him had ever ruled such a wide and scattered domain. His territories included Spain, the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, the Americas, parts of Austria, and influence across Germany. His empire was so massive that it was famously said, "The sun never sets" on the Spanish Empire, but ruling such a vast realm came with enormous challenges. At home, Charles faced unrest in Castile. A popular revolt known as the Pharaohs rebellion broke out, triggered by resentment toward his foreign advisors and the heavy taxes used to fund his European wars. Charles crushed the rebellion, but the resentment lingered. Abroad, he was constantly at war against France, the Ottoman Empire, and later the Protestant princes of Germany. Charles saw himself as a defender of Catholic Europe, fighting to keep the faith united as the Protestant Reformation began to spread, but his efforts stretched his treasury thin and drained the resources of his vast empire. In the Americas, Spanish conquistadors were expanding Charles' wealth and his responsibilities. Gold flowed in from the New World, but so did reports of abuses, rebellions, and moral outrage from the clergy. By the 1550s, exhausted by decades of war, diplomacy, and religious chaos, Charles made a rare decision. He abdicated. He split his empire in two. His brother, Ferdinand, took the Holy Roman Empire, while his son Philip II inherited Spain and its global empire. Charles retired to a monastery, leaving behind a legacy of glory, conflict, and the heavy burden of holding too much power. When Philip II inherited the Spanish crown in 1556, he didn't just become king of Spain, he became ruler of the most far-reaching empire the world had ever seen. Thanks to his father Charles I and generations of expansion, Philip II now controlled not only Spain and its vast American colonies, but also the Netherlands, southern Italy, Milan, and even the distant Philippines named in his honor. His navy patrolled the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. Gold and silver from the Americas flowed into Spain like rivers. It wasn't just territory, it was wealth, religion, and power on a scale that made Spain the superpower of the 16th century. But Philip wasn't content to simply manage his inheritance. He believed deeply in his divine mission to defend Catholicism across the world. Protestantism was spreading fast in Europe, and Philip saw it as a direct threat to both his crown and his soul. He saw himself as God's chosen king, a ruler not just of land but of hearts and faith. So he acted accordingly. He launched brutal campaigns against Protestants in the Netherlands, which led to open revolt and decades of war. His forces fought in France, in Italy, and across the High. He strengthened the Spanish Inquisition and tightly controlled religious expression at home. But his most famous and disastrous move came in 1588, when he sent the Spanish Armada to invade England, hoping to overthrow Queen Elizabeth I, a Protestant monarch. The fleet, one of the largest ever assembled at the time, was met by a smaller but faster English navy, and devastating storms. The result, a humiliating defeat that marked the beginning of Spain's long, slow decline. Despite this, under Philip II, Spain reached its peak in terms of global reach, the wealth from the New World, the influence of the Catholic Church, and the control over so many territories gave the Spanish crown a sense of divine legitimacy. But there were cracks beneath the surface: the constant wars, the reliance on colonial treasure, and the sheer weight of governing such a sprawling empire were taking their toll. Spain was powerful, but overextended. The seeds of trouble had been planted, and as history has shown time and again, no empire stays on top forever. By the late the 16th century, Spain looked invincible on the surface. Its empire stretched across continents. Its King Philip II held more territory than any other monarch in Europe, and its fleets sailed across every known ocean. But beneath the gold-plated facade, the empire was showing signs of stress. And in 1588, one disastrous event made those cracks impossible to ignore: the defeat of the, quote, Spanish Armada. The root of the conflict lay in religion and rivalry. England, under Queen Elizabeth I, had become a Protestant stronghold, and a thorn in Philip's side. English privateers like Sir Francis Drake were harassing Spanish treasure ships, looting silver from the New World, and undermining Spain's maritime dominance. Worse still, Elizabeth had supported the Protestant rebellion in the Netherlands, which Philip ruled to. Philip, this wasn't just politics, it was a religious insult. He believed it was his sacred duty to overthrow Elizabeth and restore Catholicism to England, so he planned an Ezeri invasion. The Spanish Armada, a fleet of over 130 ships, was assembled in one of the most ambitious naval operations of the age. It would sail through the English Channel, link up with Spanish forces in the Netherlands, and deliver a crushing blow to Protestant England. But almost nothing went according to plan. As the Armada moved north, it was harassed by smaller, faster English ships that used superior tactics and mobility to chip away at the fleet. The English avoided full confrontation and used fireship's vessel set ablaze and sent into the anchored Armada to scatter the Spanish formation. Then came the weather. Violent storms battered the fleet as it tried to escape northward around Scotland and Ireland. Many ships were wrecked, others lost their way, and by the time the survivors returned to Spain, only half the original fleet remained. It was more than a military loss. It was a psychological blow. The myth of Spanish invincibility had been shattered. The defeat exposed the logistical weaknesses of Spain's overextended empire. It also emboldened Spain's enemies, especially England and the Dutch Republic, both of which would grow stronger in the coming decades. For Philip II, the Armada's failure marked the beginning of the end. Spain would remain powerful, yes, but it would never again dominate Europe as it once had. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was a turning point, but Spain's downward slide wasn't driven by battles alone. Much of its long-term decline came from within, from policies that choked diversity, drained talent, and tied the monarchy too tightly to religious dogma. Throughout the late 16th and 17th centuries, Spain was consumed by an American obsession with religious purity. The Spanish Inquisition, originally created to monitor Jewish and Muslim converts, expanded its reach. It targeted anyone who deviated from strict Catholic orthodoxy. Protestants, mystics, even scientists and intellectuals. The monarchy, especially under Philip II, his successors believed religious unity was essential to national strength, but in pursuing that vision, they crippled one of Spain's greatest assets, its people. In 1609, under Philip III, Spain took a drastic step. The crown ordered the expulsion of the Moriscos Muslims, who had converted to Christianity generations earlier, but were still viewed with suspicion. Over 300 Ling people were forced to leave. Many were skilled artisans, farmers, and merchants. Their departure left vast regions depopulated and economically stagnant. Fields went untended, towns declined, and the local economies that had once thrived under cultural diversity began to wither. Meanwhile, the Inquisition continued to censor ideas, books, and academic freedom. Universities fell behind those of France, England, and the Netherlands. Spain, once home to the great intellectual exchange of Alalo, became intellectually isolated. At the same time, the monarchy relied heavily on treasure from the Americas. Gold and silver from Peru and Mexico flooded the royal treasury, but it created a false sense of wealth. Instead of investing in local industries, Spain imported goods from abroad, stunting its own economic growth. Add to this the constant warfare, especially the long and bloody fight in the Netherlands, and the treasury was constantly on the verge of collapse. Inflation soared, poverty spread, and the once glorious Spanish court became weighed down by debt. Religious intolerance didn't unify Spain, it weakened it by excluding and persecuting those who were different. The monarchy narrowed its base of support and shrank its pool of talent. It turned a once thriving multicultural empire into a brittle and dogmatic machine. Spain was still vast, still rich, still feared, but it was slowly hollowing out, and with each passing reign the throne grew a little weaker. By the 17th century, the Spanish monarchy was crumbling from within, and at the center of its decline was the once mighty Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburgs had ruled Spain since Charles II's, bringing immense power and prestige. But generations of carefully arranged marriages between royal cousins, uncles, and nieces had created a serious problem in breeding. Unlike other dynasties that married outside their borders for political alliances, the Spanish Habsburgs prioritized keeping the bloodline pure. Over time, this had devastating biological consequences. Infant mortality was high, mental and physical deformities increased, and each generation seemed weaker than the last. By the time Philip IV took the throne in 1621, the monarchy was clearly struggling. He was an intelligent man, but he leaned heavily on his favorite court minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, who pushed for aggressive military campaigns and centralization of power. These policies overextended Spain even further. The long and costly 30 years war drive agged Spain deeper into debt while internal revolts like those in Catalonia and Portugal eroded what little unity remained. Portugal would eventually break away in 1640, ending 60 years of Spanish rule. Then came Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, born in 1661. Charles was the Protestant, tragic product of centuries of inbreeding. His jaw was so deformed that he could barely. He suffered from multiple physical disabilities, was frequently ill, and never produced an heir. His reign was marked by paralysis and decline. The court was controlled by factions, and foreign powers circled like vultures, waiting for his death. Spain, once the mightiest empire in Europe, was now a shadow of its former self, economically bankrupt, politically stagnant, and militarily vulnerable. To make matters worse, Charles II was deeply religious and superstitious. He believed he was cursed and spent hours in prayer, begging for délivrance d'esprit multiple marriages. He remained childless, and the question of who would inherit the Spanish CR became an international crisis. When Charles died in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line ended with him. His death didn't just leave a vacancy, it left a power vacuum that would plunge Europe into war. But more than that, it marked the end of an era. The glory days of the Spanish Habsburgs were over, buried beneath their own obsession with purity and control. When Charles II of Spain died in 1700, without an heir, Europe held its breath. The Spanish crown controlled vast territories in Europe and the Americas, and whoever claimed it next would instantly become one of the most powerful rulers on earth. But Charles's death didn't bring peace. It sparked a continent-wide war. Before his passing, Charles had named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his successor. It seemed like a diplomatic win. France and Spain, united by blood, would preserve the Spanish Empire under a new ruler. But that solution terrified the rest of Europe. A French prince sitting on the Spanish throne meant a possible union between two superpowers, France and Spain, that was too much for England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and others. They feared a single Bourbon dynasty would dominate Europe and upset the delicate balance of power. In 1701, war erupted, known as the War of the Spanish Succession. It wasn't just a dynastic dispute, it was a struggle for control of Europe. Battles raged across the continent, from the Low Countries and Italy to Spain itself. Armies fought for over a decade, cities were razed, economies strained, and tens of thousands died within Spain. The conflict became a civil war too. Some regions, like Catalonia and Valencia, supported a rival, Austrian Clément Aer du Charles, hoping for greater autonomy if he won. But the rest of Spain, especially Castile, rallied behind Philip. The war dragged on until 1714, finally ending with the Treaty of Utrecht. The outcome: Philip was allowed to remain King of Spain as Philip, but only on the condition that Spain and France would never unite under one crown. To restore balance, Spain had to give up several European territories: the Spanish, Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Sardinia, most of which went to Austria. It was a compromised victory. Philip kept the flows. Spanish crown and the Bourbon dynasty began its long rule over Spain, but the war had a lasting cost. Spain lost its grip on European affairs. It remained a colonial power, but its influence on the continent was greatly reduced. More importantly, the war ended the Habsburg era and marked the rise of a new royal house, one that would reshape Spain from the inside out with the Treaty of Utrecht signed, and the War of Spanish Succession finally over a new royal house took the reigns of Spain, the Bourbons, and though their claim had been contested through bloodshed, there was no turning back. The Spanish Habsburgs were gone, and Philip V, the grandson of Louis XIV of France, now wore the Spanish crown. But he didn't just bring a new name to the throne, he brought an entirely new vision of monarchy. Philip V was the first truly modernizing king Spain had seen in decades. Deeply influenced by French absolutism, he sought to centralize power, streamline governance, and strip away the messy regional autonomy that had long fractured the country. In many ways, he wanted to turn Spain into a reflection of the powerful, centralized state his grandfather had built in France. His most transformative move came with the Nueva Planta decrees. These laws, passed between 1707 and 1716, effectively abolished the traditional rights and privileges of regions like Catalonia, Valencia, and Aragon, areas that had supported the rival Austrian claimant during the war. Their ancient laws, languages, and political structures were replaced with Castilian norms. Power was pulled inward, toward Madrid. To some it looked like progress. To others it felt like revenge. Philip also invested in reforming the military, reorganizing colonial administration, and strengthening the economy. Though his results were mixed, Spain was still struggling from decades of war, death, and decline. The loss of European territories hurt national pride, but Philip chose to focus on what remained: Spain's vast empire in the Americas and its growing influence in global trade. Still, Philip was a troubled ruler. He suffered from deep depression, paranoia, and episodes of instability. At one point in 1724, he abdicated the throne in favor of his son, Louis XI. But when Louis died of smallpox just months later, Philip returned to power, ruling until his own death in 1746. The Bourbon dynasty, however, was here to stay, and under Philip's success, the reformist energy would continue. Spain wasn't the empire it had once been, but it wasn't finished either. The Bourbons had inherited a broken kingdom. Now it was time to rebuild it. As the 18th century progressed, the Bourbon monarchs of Spain, starting with Ferdinand VI and continuing with Charles III, sought to modernize their kingdom in line with the ideals sweeping across Europe: reason, efficiency, and centralized authority. This was the age of the Enlightenment, and Spain, long viewed as backward and overly rigid, was finally starting to catch up. Charles III, who reigned from 1759 to 1788 is often considered Spain's enlightened despot. He admired rational thought and progressive governance, not because he was a liberal, but because he believed reform could strengthen the monarchy. Under his leadership, Spain introduced sweeping reforms. The army and navy were the dot, rebuilt roads and ports were modernized, new taxes were levied more fairly, education was expanded. Cities like Madrid saw massive urban improvements, earning Charles the nickname, the best mayor of Madrid. He also curbed the power of the Catholic Church, expelling the Jesuits in 1767 and limiting the influence of religious orders in politics for centuries. The Spanish crown had leaned on the church for legitimacy, but now the monarchy was asserting itself as supreme. These reforms, often called the Bourbon reforms, extended to Spain's colonies as well. Colonial officials were replaced with loyal bureaucrats from Spain. Trade was liberalized, taxes were increased, and local Creole elites, those of Spanish descent born in the Americas, were increasingly sidelined. But not everyone welcomed the changes. Many traditionalists in Spain opposed the Enlightenment ideals they saw as far as, and anti-religious nobles resented the loss of old privileges. Church leaders bristled at their shrinking authority in the colonies. Crees grew angry over their exclusion from power and the new economic burdens placed on them. The very reforms meant to strengthen the monarchy were planting the seeds to resistance. Despite this tension, Charles III remained popular. He balanced reform with tradition, and his reign is often seen as the last period of real stability before Spain's modern era of chaos. But his successors lacked his vision and resolve, and just as Spain was beginning to reshape itself, a storm was building across the border in France, a revolution that would shake every throne. In Europe, the Enlightenment had promised order through reason. What came next was something far more explosive. By the turn of the 19th century, Spain was a weakened but still significant European power. The Bourbon monarchy remained on its throne, but years of reform resistance and growing unrest had left the kingdom fragile, and across the Pyrenees a storm was gathering. Napoleon Bonaparte, the ambitious leader of France, had risen from the chaos of the French Revolution and now sought to control all of Europe. Spain, with its strategic location and long-standing empire, was too important to ignore. At the time, Spain was ruled by Charles IV, monarch, heavily influenced by his manipulative chief minister Manuel Godoy. Godoy's policies were unpopular, and his decision to ally with France had already dragged Spain into disastrous wars against Britain. The navy had been shattered at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Spain's prestige was crumbling. Sensing opportunity, Napoleon proposed a joint invasion of Portugal. Britain's ally Spanish forces agreed to march alongside the French, but what Spain didn't realize was that Napoleon had a much larger plan in motion. In 1808, under the guise of reinforcing troops, Napoleon flooded Spain with 80 0 soldiers. Then he turned on his ally. Charles IV was forced to abdicate after internal and rebellion, and Napoleon invited both him and his son Fearin and S to France only, to imprison them both in their place. Napoleon crowned his own brother Joseph Bonaparte as King of Spain. It was a brazen move, and it backfired. Spectacularly, the Spanish people erupted in revolt. On May 2, 1808, the citizens of Madrid rose up in defiance. French troops brutally crushed the rebellion, but it sparked a nationwide uprising. Peasants, nobles, and clergy all joined the resistance. A brutal guerrilla war began, one of the first of its kind, harassing French supply lines and drawing Napoleon into a quagmire. Meanwhile, in the countryside locale, Hunas councils formed, claiming to rule in the name of the imprisoned king, and in 1812, Spain passed its first modern constitution in Cadiz, laying the groundwork for a new constitutional monarchy. What was meant to be a quick French occupation became a nightmare for Napoleon. His forces were bogged down for years, bleeding manpower and morale, while British troops under Wellington arrived to support the Prince and Devonine Spanish cause. By 1814, the French were driven out. Ferdinand VII returned to the Rayleigh Pont-Leys throne, but Spain had changed, and the monarchy would never again rule without question. In 1814, after 6 years of war, rebellion, and French occupation, Ferdinand VII returned to Spain. The people welcomed him with cheers and hope. They called him El Diego, the desired one. To many, his return marked the end of chaos and the beginning of stability, but it didn't take long for that hope to collapse. While in exile, a new space had emerged. During the war, representatives from across the country had met in Cadiz and drafted the 1812 Constitution, a groundbreaking liberal document that limited royal power, protected civil liberties, and envisioned a constitutional monarchy. Ferdinand had promised to uphold it, but as soon as he reclaimed the throne, he tore it up, declaring himself king by divine right. Ferdinand restored absolute monarchy. With the stroke of a pen, he arrested the pentree. Liberal leaders who had written the Constitution censored the press and dissolved the new parliament. The brief experiment with constitutional government was over. His rule was marked by repression. Secret police monitored dissent. Protesters were jailed, or worse, the Inquisition was briefly revived. Spain, once energized by Enlightenment ideals, was dragged backward into reactionary absolutism. But the world around Spain was changing fast, and Ferdinand couldn't stop it. In Latin America, Spain's colonies were in open revolt, inspired by revolutionary movements in France and the United States, and emboldened by Spain's weakness. During the Napoleonic Wars, leaders like Simon Bolivar and José de San Martin led independence movements that quickly gained momentum. Spain was losing its empire, and Ferdinand was losing control. In 1820, discontent boiled over a military revolt led by liberal officers forced the king to reinstate the 1812 Constitution. For 3 years, Spain lived under what became known as the liberal triennium, but Ferdinand bided his time in 1823 with the help of French troops sent by Europe's conservative monarchies. He regained full power and crushed the liberals once more. He ruled as an absolute monarch until his death in 1833. Pharaoh VII's reign is remembered as a time of reaction, resistance, and regression. Her return to a country ready for reform but refused to change, and in doing so he planted the seeds for the civil wars and royal crises that would soon engulf Spain. The king had come back, but the kingdom had moved on. When Ferdinand VII died in 1833, he left behind more than a throne. He left a power vacuum that would throw Spain into decades of bloody conflict. The question was simple: who should rule next? But the answer would divide the country for generations. Ferdinand had no male heir. His daughter Isabella was just 3 years old when he died, but according to traditional succession laws known as the Salic law, inherited from the Bourbons, women couldn't inherit the throne years earlier. However, Ferdinand had issued the pragmatic sanction which overturned that rule and allowed his daughter to become queen. Liberals supported this change, seeing Isabella as a symbol of modernization and constitutional monarchy, but not everyone agreed. Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos rejected Isabella's claim. He saw himself as the rightful king and rallied conservatives, traditionalists, and devout Catholics to his cause. They became known as the Carlists, and in 1833 they rose in revolt. Thus began the First Carlist War, a brutal civil conflict fought between Isabellino, who supported Queen Isabella II, and liberal reforms, and Carr, who sought to restore absolutism, protect the Church's power, and maintain Spain's traditional social order. The war was vicious. Rural regions like the Basque country, Navarre, and parts of Catalonia became strongholds for Carlist forces. The Isabellino, backed by urban liberals, and the Spanish government fought to hold the country together under a modern constitution. After 7 years of fighting, the Isabellino won. Isabella II was confirmed as queen, but the schism movement didn't die. It became a permanent undercurrent in Spanish politics, a conservative rebellion waiting for its next opportunity. That opportunity came again in 1846 and later in 1872, with 2 more Carlist wars each, reflecting Spain's deeper struggle between old and new, faith and progress, monarchy and democracy. Isabella's reign, though victorious at first, was far from stable. Her rule was marred by political corruption, military interference, and scandal. She was eventually deposed in 1868 and forced into exile. The Carlist question haunted Spain well into the 20th century. More than just a fight over a crown, it represented a country torn in two between the traditions of the past and the demands of the future. Spain had chosen Isabella, but it had not yet found peace. In 1886, Alonso XIII was born into a country still reeling from internal divisions, political instability, and colonial losses. He became king the moment he was born. Literally, his father, Alonso XIII, had died months earlier, and Spain placed its hopes in the infant monarch to restore dignity and order to the troubled Bourbon dynasty, but the decades ahead would prove anything but stable as Alonso Tin grew into his role. He embraced the idea of being an active monarch. He didn't simply reign, he interfered. He met with generals, meddled in government affairs, and played favorites. While some admired his confidence, many others saw him as impulsive and politically toned. At the turn of the 20th century, Spain was no longer a great empire. The disastrous loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines in the Spanish-American War, 1898, had dealt a humiliating blow. The Spanish people were wounded culturally and economically, and a sense of national identity crisis took hold. Alfonso's reign saw a carousel of unstable governments, liberals, conservatives, and dictators all took their turn. The military became increasingly politicized. Strikes, riots, and uprisings broke out in 1909. The tragic week in Barcelona saw violent clashes between workers and the army, exposing the raw nerves of social inequality. Then came World War I. Spain remained neutral, but the war still divided the nation between pro-Allies and pro-Germans. Meanwhile, inflation, poverty, and political polarization worsened. In 1923, a frustrated military officer, Miguel Primo de Rivera, staged a coup with Alonso's blessing. For the next 7 years, Spain lived under a dictatorship. Alonso believed it would bring order, but instead it deepened the divide. When the dictatorship fell in 1930, Alfonso was left exposed, blamed for propping up tyranny. By 1931, the monarchy had lost all credibility. Municipal elections intended as a referendum on local issues turned into a referendum on the king himself. Republicans and socialists swept the vote. Massive crowds filled the streets, demanding change. Alfonso the Thief fled the country quietly and without a fight. He wasn't officially deposed, but the Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed. The next day, after centuries of royal rule, Spain had entered a new chapter, one without a king. But the story of the monarchy wasn't over. It was only on pause when Alonso the Fast left Spain. In 1931, the monarchy fell without a single shot fired. For the first time in modern history, Spain was a republic, led not by kings but by elected officials. Hope was in the air. Workers, intellectuals, women, and minorities believed a new era of democracy, progress, and equality had begun. But the Second Spanish Republic would soon prove just as unstable as the monarchy it replaced. From the start, Spain was deeply divided. Liberals, socialists, and Republicans wanted sweeping reforms, land redistribution, secular education, women's suffrage, and the weakening of the Catholic Church's power. On the other side were conservatives, monarchists, nationalists, and powerful landowners who viewed these changes as dangerous and UNS. Spanish tensions exploded quickly. Churches were burned, farmlands were seized, protests turned violent, governments rose and fell at dizzying speed. By 1936, Spain was politically fractured and bracing for civil war. That same year, a polarizing election brought a left-wing coalition, the Popular Front, to power. Alarmed by this conservative, factions in the military began plotting. Leading the conspiracy was a little-known general from the Canary Islands, Francisco Franco. In July 1936, Franco and other generals launched a military coup against the Republic. It was meant to be quick. Instead, it sparked the Spanish Civil War, a 3-year bloodbath that would scar the country for generations. The war was brutal, ideological, and deeply personal. It wasn't just soldier versus soldier. It was brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. The Republicans, supported by communists, anarchists, and international volunteers, fought for democracy and reform. The nationalists, under Franco, fought for tradition, Catholicism, and authoritarian control. By 1939, the nationalists had won. Franco marched into Madrid as dictator of Spain. The Republic collapsed. Its leaders were imprisoned, executed, or fled into exile. Franco's victory marked the beginning of a military dictatorship that would last nearly 4 decades. The monarchy was gone, democracy was dead, and Spain had become one of Europe's last fascist states. But behind the scenes, Franco was already thinking about the future, not just his own but the crown's. Because even as he crushed the Republic, he was quietly preparing for a royal return on his terms. When Francisco Franco seized power in Ezerquilensas Horminskilens, Spain became a nation frozen in time, while much of Europe moved toward democracy. After World War II, Spain plunged deeper into authoritarian rule. Franco, calling himself El Cio, the leader, ruled with absolute power. His regime was built on military control, strict censorship, Catholic conservatism, and the doubly suppression of any opposition. Political parties were banned, trade unions were outlawed, thousands of Republicans, leftists, intellectuals, and dissidents were executed or imprisoned. In the years following the war, entire families lived under surveillance. Spain became isolated, shunned by much of the international community after siding with the Axis powers in spirit, if not directly in World War II. But Franco survived as the Cold War deepened. Western powers like the United States began to see Franco as a useful anti-communist ally. By the 1950s, Spain was receiving US military and economic support. Meanwhile, Franco was thinking long-term. Though he had abolished the Republic, Franco never declared himself king. Instead, in a move that surprised many, he declared that Spain would eventually return to monarchy, but only when he decided the time was right. And in 1969, he made his choice. Frank bypassed the exiled heir of Alonso XXX and handpicked Juan Carlos, the grandson of the former king, to be his official successor. The young prince had been raised and educated under Franco's guidance, trained to carry on the regime's legacy. Many believed Juan Carlos would simply be a puppet, a symbolic king who would continue Franco's authoritarian vision after the dictator's death. Franco certainly believed that, but history would prove him wrong throughout the 1970s. As Franco's health declined, the country began to shift younger. Generations were restless. The economy, once growing, started to stall. Calls for reform grew louder, yet Franco held on. He ruled until the very end, unwilling to loosen his grip. On the 20th of November, 1975, Franco died, and just days later Juan Carlos was crowned King of Spain. Franco believed he had secured his legacy by installing a king who would uphold dictatorship. But Juan Carlos had other plans. What followed next was one of the most dramatic political transformations in Spain's history, when Juan Carlos I took the throne in 1975. Most of the world assumed he would be little more than a figurehead for Franco's legacy, a monarch handpicked by a dictator loyal to the old regime. After all, he owed his position entirely to Franco's favor. But with months, Juan Carlos began to defy expectations. Quietly, then boldly, he distanced himself from Franco. He understood something crucial. Spain was ready to change. The people, especially the youth, were done with censorship, fear, and authoritarian rule. They wanted freedom, and Juan Carlos was about to give it to them. He worked with reform-minded allies, including Adolfo Suarez, to dismantle the Franquist state from within. Together, they legalized political parties, called for free elections, and rewrote the laws that had kept Spain frozen for decades. In 1978, Spain adopted a new democratic constitution. It declared the country a parliamentary monarchy where the king would reign but not rule it, recognized regional autonomy, protected civil rights, and most importantly put the power in the hands of the people. Juan Carlos had essentially dismantled the very system that created him. But the true test came in 1981. A group of Francoist military officers, angry at the pace of reform, stormed the Spanish parliament. In an extraordinary attempted coup, armed men held lawmakers hostage. On live television, it looked like Spain might collapse back into dictatorship. And then the king stepped in wearing his military uniform. Juan Carlos appeared on national television and denounced the coup, ordering the army to remain loyal to the Constitution. His speech was clear, forceful, and powerful. The coup collapsed within hours. That moment made him a national hero. Juan Carlos had not only legitimized democracy, he had defended it. His leadership helped heal a country haunted by civil war, division, and dictatorship. For decades afterward, he was respected across Europe as the monarch who chose his people's freedom over personal power. Under Juan Carlos, Spain rejoined the international community, joined the European Union, and became a vibrant democracy. It was one of the most successful political transitions of the 20th century, and it was led by a man everyone had underestimated. But even heroes have flaws, and Juan Carlos's story wasn't over yet. For decades, King Juan Carlos I was celebrated as the architect of Spain's democracy, a modern monarch who had stood for freedom when it mattered most. But time, power, and privilege can change perceptions, and in his later years, Juan Carlos's golden image began to crack the first major blow came in 2012, while Spain was facing a brutale économique, crisis un emploiement, soaring families, losing homes, austerity, measures taking their toll. The public discovered that the king had quietly flown to Botswana on a lavish elephant hunting trip. He had gone with a wealthy businessman and was accompanied by a woman who was not his wife, and the only reason that trip became public. Juan Carlos had fallen and broken his hip, requiring emergency surgery and leaving. A paper trail photos emerged, the king posing beside a dead elephant dressed like colonial big game hunter for a nation in pain. It was a toned-deaf scandal that turned public admiration into outrage overnight. But it didn't end there. Rumors of extramarital affairs, hidden bank accounts, and offshore wealth began swirling. One of the biggest SC involved his former companion, Karina Larson, who claimed he had transferred her millions in secret gifts. Investigations revealed trails of alleged money laundering, bribes, and shady business deals, some dating back to contracts with Saudi Arabia. While prosecutors struggled to pin criminal charges on him directly, the damage to his reputation was done. By 2014, Juan Carlos made a dramatic decision. He abdicated the throne in favor of his son Felipe VI. The official reason: age and declining health. But everyone knew the truth. The monarchy's credibility was fading fast, and the only hope of saving it was a clean break. Felipe VI, younger and scandal-free, represented a chance to reset. He immediately distanced himself from his father, pledged transparency, and renounced his personal inheritance from Juan Carlos. But the damage lingered. In 2020, Juan Carlos went into self-imposed exile, living in the United Arab Emirates. He left quietly, without ceremony, a king, once beloved, now a symbol of excess and controversy. His rise had saved the monarchy. His fall nearly destroyed it. When Felipe VI ascended the Spanish throne in 2014, he inherited more than a crown. He inherited a monarchy on the edge of collapse. Public trust was at an all-time low. His father, Juan Carlos These, had gone from national hero to controversial exile. Scandal, corruption, and cynicism hung heavy over the royal family. Felipe's mission was clear: clean house and rebuild legitimacy. From the moment of his coronation, he projected a different image, more modern, more restrained, and sharply focused on transparency. He cut off his sister, Princess Christina, from royal duties after her husband was convicted in a massive embezzlement case. He renounced his inheritance from Juan Carlos and even stripped his father of royal titles to show that accountability would apply to everyone, even within the palace. Felipe also reduced the size of the royal household and published its expenses, a bold move in a country still dealing with economic hardship and distrust in public institutions. But for all his efforts, Felipe reigns in a very different Spain than the one his father inherited. Today, the king holds no real political power. Spain is a constitutional monarchy, and the king's role is largely ceremonial: opening parliament, attending state functions, and symbolizing unity. Yet even that symbolism is under strain. In 2017, Felipe faced his biggest challenge yet, Catalonia's push for independence. After an illegal referendum and declaration of secession, the king gave a rare televised speech firmly backing the Spanish constitution and denouncing the Catalan separatist movement. Supporters praised his defense of national unity. Critics accused him of inflaming tensions. Either way, the episode proved just how fragile the monarchy's role had become. Younger generations in Spain are increasingly skeptical of the monarchy. Altogether, polls show growing support for a republic, especially among the youth. The crown, once a unifying force, now faces deep generational and regional divides. Philip VI has done what he can. He's beautiful, scandal-free, and professional, but in many ways he is a king caught between errors. He carries the weight of his father's legacy, but holds none of his influence. He rules without ruling, reigns without commanding, a crown still worn, but constantly questioned. After more than 1,000 years of kings, queens, empires, exiles, and restorations, the Spanish monarchy now stands at a crossroads, uncertain, fragile, and under constant scrutiny. Under Felipe VI, the crown has worked hard to restore integrity. His reign has been steady, clean, and professional. But even with these efforts, the question looms louder than ever. Does the monarchy still have a place in modern Spain? For some, the answer is yes. They see the monarchy as a symbol of stability and continuity in a country often rocked by political deadlock. Spain has faced 4 national elections in just a few years, and the king, though neutral, has played a critical role in facilitating government formation during times of deadlock. Supporters argue that abolishing the monarchy would only create more division in a nation already struggling to stay unified. But for others, the answer is a firm, no Republican sentiment, especially among younger generations and in regions like Catalonia and the Basque Country continues to rise. The monarchy is seen by many as elitist, outdated, and inherently undemocratic. Critics argue that public offices should be earned, not inherited, and that modern Spain no longer needs a crown to define its identity. Add to that the lingering shadow of Juan Carlos, his exile, ongoing investigations, and unresolved controversies continue to tarnish the institution he once saved. Even with Felipe's clean image, the monarchy still carries the weight of past sins. And then there's the question of Princess Leonor, Philip's daughter and heir. She represents the future of the monarchy. Young, educated, and poised, she has recently stepped into the spotlight, swearing allegiance to the Constitution on her 18th birthday. But will Spain still want a queen by the time she's ready to reign? That remains the great unknown. The Spanish monarchy has survived invasions, civil wars, coups, and revolutions. It has fallen and risen again more than once, and today it walks a delicate line, balancing tradition and reform, duty and symbolism, history and relevance. Its fate doesn't lie with kings anymore. It lies with the people, and in a world that's changing faster than ever, the future of Spain's oldest institution hangs on. A single enduring question: can a crown still earn its place when it no longer holds